troops, our bases overseas and our allies throughout the world. He said, for 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted death to America and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed. He said it's been mass terror and we're not going to take it any longer. He said that America was going to destroy Iran's missiles, annihilate their navy, and he also said that while steps had been taken to avoid casualties, Americans may be lost. He called on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard to lay down their arms or face certain death. And he also addressed the people of Iran, saying the hour of your freedom is at hand. Let's bring in Deborah Haynes, our Defence and Security Editor, who was listening to that dramatic statement from the American president. Deborah, what did you make of it?
Well, I mean, he's been very clear about the objectives, and they are huge in terms of what he hopes to achieve from this operation. Describing it as major combat operations really does confirm what we were saying earlier about the scale of this attack and how it differs from the previous time that Donald Trump decided to strike Iran. This is clearly not just some limited operation, given what Donald Trump has now set out. He's not saying there's going to be regime change, but he is making very clear that the military action that the US is taking is designed to destroy the regime effectively. And that's why he's making that call to the Iranian people, saying that for them, this is a once in a many generation time to step up and take control. So that does signal that he doesn't see the US playing a role in whatever comes next, but instead is handing that over to the Iranian people, which is, obviously it sounds like a noble statement, but everyone who understands the region understands the enormous risk that's involved here. He's saying as well, so the stated aims that Donald Trump is making in this video address are significant and are clearly benchmarks that he can be held to account for with whatever comes next. He's talking about, as you say, annihilating the Iranian Navy, destroying its missiles, preventing Iran, and he said this repeatedly, from ever having nuclear weapons. And as well, talking directly to all members, not just of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but also the wider armed forces and the police, all arms of defense and security within Iran, telling them to lay down their weapons. They will be given immunity, or else they will be annihilated. So really making clear the choice that's at stake there. Does the military stay loyal to the regime, or do they allow this American operation supported by Israel to deliver what Donald Trump is saying that it will in terms of a complete overhaul, destruction of the military capabilities of Iran, and therefore, by definition, from what he's saying, the ability of the regime to continue to rule. He didn't say the words regime change. That would be a huge allergic reaction from his own base, who are very anxious about any kind of never-ending wars. But by taking this action, calling it major combat operations, setting out objectives that he wants to stop, to defend the American people from imminent threats from the Iranian regime, to say that he wants to destroy all of its military capabilities. These are serious, significant and large-scale objectives that will not be achieved overnight unless there is complete surrender. And from what we're hearing from reports on the Iranian side, that is not going to happen. There will be a war, and America's president did make clear that America needs to brace itself for taking casualties. And the big question is just how extensive that's going to be. Is military force alone by the Americans? Yes, they have the most powerful armed forces in the world. There's no question of that. But can that military action alone achieve the objectives that Donald Trump has now set out squarely and publicly, and achieve that with acceptable levels on the American side of harm? That is a huge question, a huge risk. Donald Trump clearly believes the answer is yes, but he cannot see the future. And the future, as we know, when it comes to military operations in the Middle East, it is incredibly risky, incredibly unpredictable, and can go very wrong.
Deborah, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. I want to bring in now Tara Kangaloo, who's the author of The Heartbeat of Iran and a global affairs journalist. Tara, thanks so much for talking to us this morning. We've spoken to you in the last few weeks about the feelings in Iran and the tensions that have been building there with threats from the US. What do you make of what's happened this morning, and how do you think that people in Iran will be responding?
Good morning, Anna. This is a fast-moving story, and just speaking to some folks in Tehran this morning, people are on the edge. Saturday today is the first day of the week in Iran, and people are, in the offices, back to school, back at work. And so you have a situation in the city where life is normal, moving forward, but then all of a sudden in the morning, you see multiple areas hit. As you've been saying on the program, the Pasteur complex that houses the presidential palace, as well as the house of the supreme leader, and multiple government offices, an extremely important area, is reportedly hit. Multiple news sites, Iranian news sites, have been hacked. And again, speaking to folks, people are on the edge, but many expected this because this, just like June, as the U.S. and Iran were negotiating, Israel hit, and then the United States continued a week later. But this seems to be a joint effort by Israel and the United States. But right now, people in Iran are holding their breath. They are unclear what's going to happen next. All the while, the resentment toward the regime is intact. At the same time, they have no idea what's in store for them.
Yes, and in the meantime, the Iranian regime has hit back and said that they will retaliate, a crushing retaliation, they say. In the meantime, Donald Trump is appealing to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard to lay down their arms or face certain death. What do you expect the response of the regime to be?
I think there is a contrast between what we hear from the Islamic regime, and this has been proven historically, and their action over the last, not just the summer conflict, the 12-day conflict, but even previous rounds of retaliation. Iran's strikes have been, in some ways, completely coordinated and surgical, with no casualties, no American casualties. And Israeli casualties have been limited during the 12-day war. So I wonder if that's what we're going to see, some form of a coordinated attack, just so that Iran can say we retaliated, save face among its base of supporters domestically, but also contain, again, the casualties on the side of Israel and the United States, because the Islamic regime is very well aware that a military as mighty as that of the United States and Israel
مختلف يوما عن آخر، لربما ليلة أمس، وإن كانت ثم دوي صفارات الإنذار والتعامل مع الطائرات المسيرة، إلا أنها قد تعتبر هادئة نوعا ما. على الجانب الدبلوماسي كما تعلمين، الكويت قد استدعت السفير الإيراني للمرة الثانية وسلمته كتاب احتجاج، وكذلك طالبتهم بوقف العدوان العدوان على الكويت، كما كان هناك تحرك دبلوماسي كويتي لدى الجانب العراقي من أنهم يريدون وقف أيضا العمليات التي تنطلق من العراق، من الأراضي العراق أو من الدول المجاورة له بأيادي ميليشيات مسلحة قد تطلق صواريخ. الكويت أعطت معلومات، العراق كانت أيضا قد ضبطت منصتين لإطلاق الصواريخ قبل ذلك بأيام قليلة، لكن هذا الأمر بات يتكرر مرة أخرى، والكويت تطالب العراق باتخاذ مواقف جادة لعدم تأثر العلاقات الأخوية بين البلدين، وهو ما تريده دائما الكويت، وما جاء أيضا على لسان أميرها من أنه يريد تخفيض هذا التصعيد، وبالتالي كان يقول على إيران أن توقف هذا الهجوم لأننا نعتبرها كانت دولة صديقة وجارة، وبالتالي هذا العدوان عدوان آثم، ومن حق الكويت أن تحافظ على سيادة أراضيها واستخدام المادة 51 من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. كل تلك الحركة الدبلوماسية تأتي بموازاة ما يحدث على الأرض من قبل الوزارات. وزارة الكهرباء مثلا أصلحت الأعطال التي كانت موجودة في تيارات الكهرباء الهوائية أو نقل الكهرباء، وبالتالي أصلحت خط تيار هوائي جديد، إضافة إلى 7 قد تم إصلاحهم أيضا في فترة الهدوء السابقة التي مرت بها الكويت. الآن طبعا كما تعلمين عند اعتراض الصاروخ تطير الشظايا وتؤثر على هذه التيارات الهوائية لنقل الكهرباء، وهي كونها مكشوفة تتم إصلاحها من قبل وزارة الكهرباء.
من الكويت مفاد العربية عادل عيدان، شكرا على كل هذه المعلومات. نذكر مشاهدينا بما يقوله رئيس أرامكو للعربية بزنس، يتحدث بداية عن البنية التحتية الكبيرة التي تملكها الشركة وتوفر مرونة عالية وأيضا خيارات متعددة. أثبتنا على مدى عقود قدرتنا على مواجهة التحديات، ولدينا حضور قوي في جميع مراكز الطلب الرئيسية في النفط. طبعا الحديث لرئيس أرامكو، نبيع معظم إنتاجنا من النفط بعقود طويلة الأجل، ولدينا خبرة مثل ما ذكرنا في التعامل مع الظروف الصعبة. يؤكد أيضا بأن قطاع الطاقة كان يواجه مشهدا متقلبا حتى قبل الأحداث الأخيرة، والمشهد الجيوسياسي الحالي يمثل حالة من الغموض وأيضا التعقيد. يؤكد بنفس الوقت على المرونة ومرونة الشركة، وأنها تمكنها من التعامل مع الظروف الصعبة، ونواصل تعزيز خطط الطوارئ والتدريب للتعامل مع مختلف الظروف. رئيس أرامكو يشدد للعربية بزنس بأن الأولوية الحالية هي سلامة العاملين واستمرار العمليات. إذن في أيضا أخبار عاجلة أخرى مرتبطة بهذه الحرب الدائرة الآن. قالت إسرائيل إنها ضربت قاذفة صواريخ إيرانية بعد وقت قصير من تعرضها لهجوم صاروخي وانطلق من أراضيها. الجيش الإسرائيلي في بيان له قال إنه حدد انطلاق دفعة صواريخ من إيران باتجاه أراضي إسرائيل، مضيفا أن الأنظمة الدفاعية عملت على اعتراض التهديد بعد أن تسببت الصواريخ بانطلاق صافرات الإنذار في مناطق عدة من إسرائيل، ما أجبر السكان على التوجه إلى الملاجئ. الجيش الإسرائيلي كان أعلن أنه شن موجة جديدة من الغارات الواسعة على العاصمة الإيرانية طهران، هي الثانية خلال 24 ساعة الماضية. وقال الجيش في بيان إن قواته نفذت موجة واسعة من الغارات استهدفت أهدافا تابعة للنظام الإيراني في طهران، بما في ذلك مقار وبنى تحتية تابعة للحرس الثوري، إضافة إلى مواقع إنتاج وتخزين للصواريخ.
Why is it do that?
وجه الجيش الإسرائيلي إنذارا بالإخلاء لسكان مبان في صور وصيدا بلبنان. إسرائيل كانت شنت غارات ليلية استهدفت قرى في جنوب وشرق لبنان. وبحسب وكالة الأنباء اللبنانية نفذ الجيش الإسرائيلي غارات على بلدات المجادل وشقرة والصريفة والريحان في الجنوب، إضافة إلى مرتفعات عين التين في البقاع الغربية. في لبنان أيضا أفادت مراسلة العربية أن دفعة صاروخية أطلقت من قبل حزب الله باتجاه شمال إسرائيل، فيما قال الحزب إنه تصدى لمحاولة تقدم إسرائيلية عند أطراف مدينة الخيام. قبل ذلك قال الجيش الإسرائيلي إنه ضرب منصة أطلقت صواريخ من لبنان باتجاه شمال إسرائيل. نتابع الصور. وفي عدة بيانات متتالية منذ فجر اليوم أعلن حزب الله عن استهدافه عدة مواقع تابعة للجيش الإسرائيلي داخل لبنان، أبرزها في الخيام وعيترون بقذائف مدفعية وصاروخية. كما أعلن أن عناصره اشتبكوا مع القوات الإسرائيلية عند الأطراف الجنوبية لمدينة الخيام جنوب لبنان. كما أعلن حزب الله استهدافه موقعا في مرتفع كحيل عند الأطراف الشرقية لمارون الراس، إضافة لموقع المرج مقابل بلدة مركبة الحدودية.
Could see that the attack yesterday and these fears from Hezbollah missiles are worrying the Israeli officials, and they're trying to calm the population down by saying that the war is ahead of schedule and they will continue to.
Nida, thank you for the update. Nida Ibrahim live for us there in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. And there's been heavy bombardment in Iran. Emergency teams there are still searching through the rubble for of a residential building in the capital, Tehran, after it was hit by a U.S.-Israeli strike on Monday near Risalet Square in the east of Tehran. According to state media, about 40 people were killed in that attack. And people in Iran have been enduring some of the most intense bombardment overnight since the U.S. and Israel's attacks began. Huge explosions were reported in Karaj, close to Tehran. Several homes were destroyed. Tawhid, tell us more about these attacks. Even as President Trump talks about possibly ending the war soon, there's been really heavy bombardment across the country.
Yes, indeed. The reality on the ground shows that we have been witnessing the continuation of the airstrikes by the Americans and Israelis as we are on day 11 since the initiation of these campaign of strikes. And of course, starting from midnight, we also were able here in the capital to hear the after sound of multiple massive and really massive explosions across the Iranian capital, Tehran. Reports are coming about the explosions being occurred in the western, eastern, as well as southern parts of the capital. And of course, it goes without saying that these strikes are not basically limited to the capital, as we also received reports from Arak, Ahvaz, Isfahan, Tabriz, and many other cities across the country about the continuation of these strikes. The latest reports say that at least more than 200 cities have been targeted by these strikes across the Iranian territories. And of course, this is not just a military headquarters or police stations or state buildings being targeted, but also residential areas are also being hit, including the schools, actually hospitals and buildings belonging to very ordinary citizens. And there is now a growing concern about the civilian fatalities. The latest reports indicate that more than 1,000 people have been killed, with more than 12,000 being injured. However, we know that due to the very ongoing nature of these strikes, we can rest assured as a matter of misfortune that there could be more casualties. The latest was in Risalet Square, where according to the Iranian media outlets, they're saying that at least more than 40 people have lost their lives in just one of these strikes.
Tawhid, thank you so much for bringing us the latest there from Tehran. Tawhid Asadi in the Iranian capital. And there have been several new Iranian strikes targeting the Gulf region. In Bahrain, a residential tower was hit in the Sif district of the capital, Manama. Officials say a 29-year-old woman was killed and 8 people injured. The UAE and Kuwait say they've also been intercepting missiles and drones. And Saudi Arabia's civil defense says a drone fell into a residential area in Zulfi, a city in Riyadh province. Axel Zaimovic is keeping an eye on the situation across the region for us here in Doha. So more strikes, Iranian strikes across the Gulf region in these last 24 hours. What's been the scale and what have been the targets?
That's right. We're getting these updates from different countries from the region, and from that we can understand the scale of these attacks. As you said, you mentioned briefly, in Saudi Arabia, we're getting reports that a drone pretty much crashed on a residential area in Al Zulfi. There are no reports of any casualties, but what we understand that these residential complexes suffered some major material damage over there. In Kuwait, we're hearing that the National Guard has intercepted the 6 drones coming towards the country. The officials there, they say the operation is part of their ongoing efforts to strengthen security, but also to protect some of the most important and vital civil and infrastructure and the energy infrastructure in the country. But also in Qatar, we're getting that in the past 24 hours that 17 missiles have been intercepted, but also 7 drones coming towards the country. And the same situation happened as well in the United Arab Emirates. The emergency teams and the security forces are working around the clock to protect the country from incoming missiles and drones from the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And of course, these attacks have had a huge impact on energy infrastructure in the region because some of them targeted energy infrastructure in countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. What are Gulf states saying about the status of the energy infrastructure? When are they expecting to resume production and export of oil, for example, in some of these countries?
We're actually seeing that these attacks, particularly in the past 24 hours, they've been targeting this energy infrastructure. For example, in Bahrain, there was an oil field that was targeted over there, one of the largest refineries. We've seen in Saudi Arabia as well, in Shobain, they targeted that exports toward the rest of the world. For example, Saudi Arabia says that they are lowering production between 2 and 2.5 million barrels a day. And for example, before the war, Saudi Arabia was producing between 10 and 11 million barrels a day. Also, we're getting the same kind of reports coming from the United Arab Emirates. Kuwait is going to do the same. So altogether, these substantial reductions from some of the world's most important producers is going to definitely take a toll for the rest of the world.
Thank you, Axel, for the update. Axel Zaimovic in Doha. Well, after days of rapid increases in oil prices, there's been some reprieve after President Trump's comments on ending the war soon. Let's take a look at how volatile the market has been in the last few days. Brent crude, the most traded type of oil, averaged around $71 a barrel in February. It rose to $78 on March 2nd, the first day of trading after the war began. It surged past the $100 mark early on Monday, but has now dropped back down to around $88 a barrel on Tuesday. West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, is the other benchmark, averaged around $65 a barrel in February. It climbed to $71 on March 2nd and broke through $100 on Monday before coming down to just under $90 too. Well, global markets have also shown signs of rebounding. Early trading suggests Asian markets have been supported by a dip in oil prices. Stocks in China and Hong Kong have bounced back from the lowest levels since December and August. Let's find out more with Katrina Yu in Beijing. Katrina, quite a rebound across Asian markets. Tell us about how they're doing.
Well, over the last 24 hours, it seems that there hasn't been any significant or dramatic change when it comes to the war. But if you look at the stock markets across Asia, it seems like the difference is night and day. We had on Monday, regionally, when you look at the financial markets, lots of drops, lots of declines. But on Tuesday, many of those markets are doing much, much better. And the reason, well, it's largely because of Donald Trump's comment that the war in Iran is going to end soon. It will probably not end by the end of this week, but just that word soon seems to have been enough to soothe these panicked investors here in Asia. And on Tuesday, one of the best performing markets, for example, is the Kospi in South Korea. It has been up more than 5.3%. That is after plunging almost 6% on Monday. South Korea is particularly vulnerable to any disruption of energy exports coming from the Gulf. And already since the war in Iran began, twice the circuit breakers in the South Korean stock market have been triggered. So some reprieve there. Also some reprieve in Japan's Nikkei. That is up 2.88%. Australia, Taiwan, Shanghai, all up more than about 1%. Hong Kong is up 2.71%. And India also up about 1%. Emerging markets across the board are all up. This emerging market index is up 3%, and it's had its best performing day on Tuesday since February. It's not just stock markets that are doing well today on Tuesday, it's also Asian currencies, and in particular, the Malaysian ringgit and the Thai baht have also strengthened quite significantly.
While markets are down, markets are up, but oil is down. Katrina.
That's right. As you mentioned before, oil has seen some really volatile highs and lows. It, on Monday, soared past that psychological price point of $100 per barrel, reaching almost $120 at its peak on Monday. And now it's plunged back down again. It is hovering around the $90 mark as I speak. And that is, of course, because of the Trump comments. Also, Trump's comments that he may be lifting some of oil-related sanctions the U.S. has put on Iran, and also the news that the U.S. will allow some of its Navy vessels to try to escort some of those tankers so that they can passage safely through the Strait of Hormuz. And also we had that news earlier on Monday that G7 finance ministers have put on the table as an option releasing some of their strategic oil reserves. And traders, investors, they're looking at all of these signals as to be very reassuring things. And that's why we're seeing the stock market perform so well. However, many analysts are warning that this is far from over. We've had those comments from Trump, but this doesn't mean that the price of oil isn't going to soar again over the next few weeks. We still have to wait and see. And certainly governments across Asia, including the Chinese government, are maintaining their caution. China, for example, on Tuesday morning, people here woke up to higher prices for gasoline and diesel. They're 8% more expensive, and that is remaining in place for the foreseeable future. And also, China is also taking no chances when it comes to the safety of its own citizens. We've just had the news as well on Tuesday afternoon that 10,000 Chinese nationals have been repatriated from the Middle East over the last few days.
Katrina, thank you very much for that. Katrina, you live for us there in Beijing. Now, Saudi Arabia's oil giant Aramco has warned there could be catastrophic consequences for the world's oil markets the longer the disruption at the Strait of Hormuz goes on. President Trump has warned that Iran will be hit, quote, 20 times harder if it stops the flow of oil through the strait. The area is a transit point for 20% of the world's oil and gas. Kulsum Sharif explains.
Since the start of the conflict, some of the major oil and gas producers in the Middle East have halted production one by one. So oil exports have abruptly stopped right from Qatar to Iraq due to attacks on energy infrastructure. Now, nearly half of the world's oil reserves and production comes from this region. Now, Saudi Arabia is a leading exporter. Now, this image should explain why it was forced to halt production at one of its biggest domestic oil refinery, Ras Tanura. Debris from intercepted Iranian drone caused a fire here. Now, apart from crude oil exports, the Middle East is also a powerhouse when it comes to liquefied natural gas. Now, Qatar is a leading producer, supplying nearly 20% of global LNG. Now, it operates a field along with Iran. Now, this is South Pass, not Dome Field. Now, the south portion of it is operated by Qatar and the northern part of it by Iran. But production has completely stopped here. Even if production were to continue, we have another problem, the problem of transportation, because the Iranian threats have effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz. So all the oil and gas that has been produced in the region is not being supplied through. Normally, most of the supplies go through the Strait of Hormuz to Asia, but some of them also to Europe, right up from the Arabian Sea and through the Suez Canal. Now, the closure of the strait has already pushed up oil and gas prices. And the world has actually seen that play out after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, stock markets have slumped, oil prices have jumped right from Asia to America.
Hungary's government says it's banned the export of crude oil, diesel and some petrol. It will also be releasing 45 days' worth of state fuel reserves. The Hungarian Prime Minister says this is partially a result of the conflict in the Middle East.
Due to the war in Iran and the Ukrainian oil blockade, Hungary has unfortunately also been affected by the explosion in international oil prices. Fuel prices have begun to rise sharply across Europe, so at today's government meeting we decided that we will protect Hungarian families, Hungarian entrepreneurs and Hungarian farmers. We are introducing a protected price for both gasoline and diesel, above which retail prices cannot go.
Now, while President Trump says the war with Iran could end soon, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said negotiations with the U.S. is off the table.
After 3 rounds of negotiation, and after the American team in the negotiation, said itself that we made a big progress, still they decided to attack us. So I don't think, talking with Americans anymore would be, on our agenda anymore.
Let's discuss this now with our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who's joining me here in the studio. James, the Iranians clearly not interested in talking right now. Why is that? Why are they putting diplomacy to the side?
Well, I think that they don't trust the United States after what's happened in the past. And it's very interesting that we have President Trump, maybe partly to calm the markets because he's very concerned about the US economy and potentially the political ramifications of that. But him talking now about the war maybe coming to an end, he said his words, very complete pretty much. Sorry about the grammar, it's not mine, his, but that's where he says we're very far ahead of schedule. So different from a few days ago when he was demanding unconditional surrender. Well, I think the Iranians making it very clear to us that there are 2 sides in this war, and the war doesn't end just because President Trump says the war ends. If we have a situation where President Trump declares victory and Iran is still firing missiles, then there is no end to the war. Iran, as I say, twice now feels that diplomacy was used as a ruse. There were talks underway even when this latest conflict started. Further talks have been planned in Geneva. They don't trust the United States, is what they are saying. And so if the US said the war was over, would Iran trust them? I think there's a real problem here that we will not get a repeat of what we had at the end of 12 days in June last year, where it just stopped and in fact, diplomacy resumed, and we even had Iran sitting down with the US for further nuclear talks. I don't think Iran will play that game again.
Yeah, and there's also a third actor. I mean, you said 2 sides, but actually there's a third actor here, which is Israel, which started this war on Iran with the United States. They also, as far as Nita was telling us, are not interested in ending this war right now. How is that going to affect the relationship between the US and Israel?
Yeah, I mean, Trump is involved in a war and he's fighting a war, but it's very much a joint venture with Israel also involved with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they have been very close so far. An argument, a little bit of a disagreement, we think, over targets when that fuel dump was hit. in recent days. But until now, no real disagreement. I think the problems come about where to end the war. President Trump, I think, because he's had so many different reasons for this war, so many shifting reasons why he went to war, very easy for him to say, well, I've met my objectives, the war is over. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, he hasn't had shifting aims. He has made it clear that he wants to remove the regime in Tehran. He's been saying that not just at the start of this conflict, he's been saying it for decades. It's been almost one of the major issues of his whole political career. And with elections due in Israel, will the Israeli public accept a situation where you have the son of the supreme leader, now the supreme leader, a more hardline figure? The Israeli population have had Iran demonized by Netanyahu for decades. The US may be prepared, the US public may be prepared to accept that scenario because they're not following this as closely. The Israelis, I think, no.
Right. What about other big powers here, Russia and China? Is there any indication that they are perhaps doing something behind the scenes to try and end this conflict? Because as we've heard from Saudi Arabia, huge consequences, huge economic implications if the Strait of Hormuz continues to remain closed.
Well, we've heard from the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran that perhaps Russia and China, which are allies of Iran, although they've not joined in any way militarily, and France, another key player, have talked about possible negotiations. That would be interesting because there's this mistrust on both sides that we have there now. Could this be internationalized? Could there be an international mechanism? And in fact, it almost takes us back to where we were before all of this, before Trump ended the nuclear deal, because there was the old P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany involved in joint diplomacy. Maybe a mechanism like that is needed to end that. But of course, President Trump, that's not something he's accepted till now. He's very much wanted to call all the shots.
James, thank you very much. James Space is our diplomatic editor. You're watching Al Jazeera. It's just gone past 11:30 GMT, day 11 of the US-Israel war on Iran, a conflict that has already spread to large parts of the Middle East and is threatening global fuel supplies. These are the latest developments. President Donald Trump has said the US and Israel are close to completing their objectives in Iran and that the war will end very soon, but not this week. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has dismissed his comments as nonsense. Global markets have shown signs of rebounding. Investors are optimistic the war on Iran could end soon following the comments from President Trump. Early trading shows a dip in oil prices has helped Asian markets. But people in Iran have been experiencing some of the most intense bombardments since the US and Israel's attacks began. There were major explosions overnight in Karaj, close to the capital, Tehran. Several homes were destroyed. Well, to discuss these latest developments, I'm now joined by Gideon Levy, a columnist at Haaretz newspaper. He's in Tel Aviv, and Scott Lucas, professor of U.S. and international politics at the University College Dublin, is joining us from Ireland. Thank you both very much for joining us. Gideon, let me start with you, if I can, about President Trump's comments suggesting that the war will end soon and that this will be a mutual decision with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Is that the case? How closely aligned are Washington and Israel right now on how and when this war should end?
Washington and Israel are very close now, but there is only one person who will decide when will this war end, like there was only one person who decided when will it start, namely President Donald Trump. Israel is quite a partner for this adventure, but the last word will be Trump's word, no doubt about it.
Scott Lucas, your thoughts? Do you agree with that the last word on when the war should end will be Trump's decision?
Yeah, Israel can't continue without Trump's support. But the problem here is using Trump's words as a marker of where we are. The statements that are being headlined that, the war is very close to an end. He also said in the same conversations, well, we've won, but we have to win more. And this is going to go farther. The reality here is that Trump was rattled. yesterday. He was rattled by the surge in oil prices. He was rattled, as James Bays explained, by the effects on stock markets. He's rattled because there's domestic pressure against these military operations. And so he was sort of throwing this out. Hey, everybody, don't worry. It's going to be over quite soon. But then in the next breath saying, but we've got to make sure that we crush the regime. And those two things are not compatible.
There's certainly mixed messages from the administration. Gideon Levy, on the objectives, we've heard from Israel's ambassador to France in the last hour saying that the objective is to weaken Iranian authorities so people can take control of their own fate. And we've heard from President Trump that the U.S. and Israel are close to completing their objectives. But are the objectives the same from Israel's perspective? What exactly are the objectives, and have they really been achieved?
First of all, there are the declared objectives, which also changed both in the United States and in Israel. And there are the visible objective, because the declared objective of changing the regime in Iran, and by the way, not knowing who is going to replace the current regime, seems right now is unachievable. It takes some time for both leaders to realize it, I guess. Maybe Donald Trump realized it already, and maybe also Netanyahu will realize it soon. But it doesn't seem, because this regime will not fall in one day. Maybe we started the process now to weaken it. So you will see all kinds of declarations in the coming days in order to get down from this high tree that they both climbed on, in order to save face and say that many things were achieved. Practically, I'm very skeptical about those achievements of this war, but let time speak. Let's wait until it ends.
Scott Lucas, as you said, I mean, domestic political considerations are also at play here as far as President Trump is concerned, the economy as well. How can he save face, as Gideon says, to exit this war in a way that he doesn't come out as a loser in this?
Well, I mean, the Trump camp objectives was slightly different from Israel, whereas they didn't necessarily want regime change. They wanted regime surrender, the regime to give up its nuclear program entirely, to give up its ballistic missile program, to break its alliances in the Middle East. The problem here is that the regime doesn't appear to be even giving way on those conditions. So where's the off-ramp? The off-ramp, the only countries I think that have leverage here are the Gulf states. That's because of Trump's personal investments, his family investments with the Gulf states. It's because of oil, U.S. bases, strategic interest. Qatar has been trying to mediate for the past week to find an opening with the Trump camp. They haven't gotten it so far. But if the domestic situation worsens for Trump, then there may be that opening for the Gulf states to say, look, we need to pull back on this. That is especially true if oil prices, which did drop last night, if there is another surge in them in the days to come.
Gideon, do you agree with that the Gulf states have leverage here? And do they have any leverage at all with Israel if the objectives, as you both seem to agree, are different?
Yeah, they have leverage, but it is limited. We have to realize that before the war, at least on the surface, they were all pushing Trump not to go for this war, and he quite ignored them. Later on, we heard that Saudi Arabia spoke in 2 languages, but about Qatar and the Emirates and the others, I'm not sure they spoke in 2 languages. I guess they were really objecting this war, and Donald Trump ignored them. So their leverage is very limited. So is Israel. Israel is extremely influential for the decision to go to this war. I have my doubts that Israel will have the same influence about ending it, but maybe. We are dealing, and again, we have to say it, we are dealing with an unpredictable and not always consistent decision maker, namely Donald Trump, and therefore all the forecasts might be wrong.
Do you think the fact that the objectives, Gideon, I want to ask you this, the fact that the objectives on both sides, from the Israelis and Americans, seem to be different here, does this expose the limits of the partnership? And do you think this is a real test now for the relationship if they cannot agree on when and how to end this war?
No, I don't think so, Foley. I think that what is challenged or what should be the consequence is to understand not the limits of the relationship between Israel and the United States, but finally and once for all to understand the limits of using military capabilities as efficient and as strong and sophisticated they are. They have their limits. Time after time, Israel is launching wars and achieves very little, if at all. We have seen 2.5 years in Gaza, which led almost to nothing. Now it is Lebanon, destroying Lebanon. I doubt it that any achievement will be there. And same also with this war.
Yeah, briefly, Gideon, I want to ask you before I go back to Scott, whether in Israel there's a debate right now about whether the war has gone far enough or whether it risks becoming a prolonged regional conflict. As you mentioned, Israel is engaged in Gaza still. In Lebanon now, we're seeing it as well. Is there a debate right now within Israel that this has gone on for too long?
No debate whatsoever. 94% of the Jewish Israelis support this war. The Israelis always support wars, at least at their beginnings. And any debate is almost illegitimate. The Israeli discourse cannot contain now any doubts or any question marks.
Okay, Scott Lucas, your thoughts finally on how this ends, and if there are disagreements in the objectives between Israel and the U.S., how serious is that, and what could it mean to ending the war?
I think Gideon's right that you're still going to have the Trump partnership with Israel, even if the Trump folks say to Israel at some point, look, we've got to pull back from this. And I think that there's already a wobble, I think, from the Netanyahu government saying, oh, it's the Iranian people who have to rise up now. But I think, cut to the chase here, when Donald Trump and his inner circle believe that they have lost a lot of the American people, and 56% of Americans already oppose this war, if the global oil price goes back well over $100 and approaches $150 per barrel, when the U.S. stock markets start coming down, and when you threaten to basically add to not only the U.S. economic problems, but a global economic crisis, that's when they stop. You just have to have someone help them stop and try to save face.
Gentlemen, thank you both for a very interesting discussion. Gideon Levy, Scott Lucas, thank you for joining us on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elsewhere, several strikes have been reported in northern Iraq. One of them hit a camp hosting fighters from the Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces near the city of Kirkuk. Iraq has faced frequent attacks since the conflict in the Middle East began last week. Meanwhile, thousands of Afghans living in Iran are fleeing across the border because of the attacks by the U.S. and Israel. According to the United Nations, between 3 and 5 million Afghans live in Iran. Around 2,000 are crossing the border every day to seek safety. Many of them have been repeatedly displaced by decades of conflict, violence, and poverty. I spoke earlier to Arafat Jamal, who's a representative of the UN's refugee agency in Afghanistan. He says there are no good choices for Afghans deciding whether to remain in Iran or return home.
What we've seen is about 110,000 have crossed over this year. What I would say is that they're reporting that they are fleeing the conditions of war that all people inside Iran are experiencing. They are not at this point highlighting any specific concerns for Afghans. However, what we're witnessing here is a lot of tension and apprehension. This is just the beginning, and the repercussions of this conflict are being felt throughout the region. Of course, for these people, there are no good choices. They're fleeing one war and coming to another, because I'm sure your viewers remember that we here in Afghanistan are experiencing a second war, a war that predated the one in Iran between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So they're fleeing one conflict and entering another one at the moment. This is coming on the back of a mass movement of people last year. Last year, the movement of Afghans back to Afghanistan, 2.8 million, was the largest such movement globally. So now, as we start this year, it's picking up again, and we are seeing refugees, we are seeing migrants, we are seeing passport holders, and so on. And at the moment, it seems to be more of a preemptive move. People are describing bombs on them, a great deal of fear, but they're also describing a dysfunctional economy where these people who filled in many of the different slots in the labor market are unable to find jobs.
Israeli forces have launched a series of attacks across southern and eastern Lebanon. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has intensified since the U.S. and Israel began their war in Iran. Israeli media are reporting that Israel intends to expand its buffer zone along the Lebanese border beyond its current presence in the south. The Lebanese government has called for direct talks with Israel to end the fighting. Well, Lebanon's largest stadium has been transformed into a refugee center to house displaced people. The government and aid groups are struggling to find enough shelter for the hundreds of thousands of people forced from their homes. Bernard Smith reports from Beirut.
Lebanon's government is struggling to meet the demand for emergency shelter. This stadium is being converted into a mini tent city, but there aren't enough tents to meet the enormous demand. There are 800 people in here so far, including Marwa El Shalak, who is heavily pregnant and could give birth at any moment, but their home's been totally destroyed and they've been left sheltering here.
We were staying in the southern suburbs. The strike started suddenly during the night, around 3 a.m. We took a car and went to central Beirut, and then some people brought us here to the sports city. Our situation is very difficult. I could give birth at any moment, and I'm very worried about how I'm supposed to stay in a tent in this kind of weather.
The UN estimates almost 700,000 people have been internally displaced, and most of them are living in either hotels, private rented accommodation, or staying with friends. And those that don't have those options, those that don't have the means to rent or pay for hotels, are in government shelters like this, and there is enormous need. And those that are here could be here now for many more weeks or even months to come. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Turkey's defense ministry says it will not hesitate to act if its airspace or land are threatened. The comments come after a missile was downed. In a statement, the ministry said a ballistic missile launched from Iran and detected heading towards Turkey was intercepted and neutralized by NATO air and missile defense systems. No casualties or damage were reported. Turkish institutions began monitoring the incident immediately. Ankara emphasized its capability and determination to protect national airspace and border security, while warning that further escalation in the region must be avoided. Sinem Koseulu has more from Istanbul.
This missile incident is definitely a balancing act for Turkey, as Turkey and Iran are neighbors sharing a 534 kilometers of borders that were drawn in the 17th century. No fights, no wars since then, but also Turkey is a NATO ally. It's a NATO country with the second largest military, and according to NATO, any attack targeting a NATO country would be considered an attack targeting all other NATO countries. However, so far, 2 missiles reached Turkish soil. They were intercepted in the atmosphere by the U.S. air defense system in the eastern Mediterranean. The Iranian side has been saying that that was an accident. The rockets were not targeting Turkey. Turkey made the necessary warnings, and we heard Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Monday saying that they made the necessary warnings to the Iranian side. But however, according to Turkish Foreign Ministry especially, how far these accidents will happen is an important matter. But definitely Turkey doesn't want any destabilization in the region. Turkey doesn't want any destabilization within Iran, and Turkey supports the territorial integrity in the region, all neighbors, all countries. Sinem Koseulu, Al Jazeera, Istanbul.
France's president has pledged to defend Cyprus and deploy more warships to the eastern Mediterranean. Emmanuel Macron and Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis visited the island on Monday. Earlier this month, a drone caused minor damage at a British base in Cyprus, while others were intercepted. John Serapoulos reports from Paphos.
France declared its presence unmistakably, with the French presidential aircraft's arrival on Cyprus and the presence of its frigate and the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier nearby. Together with the Greek Prime Minister, President Emmanuel Macron was claiming European primacy in the eastern Mediterranean.
Coming here with the Greek Prime Minister, I want to say that an attack on Cyprus is an attack on Europe.
and the defence of Cyprus is a vital issue for your neighbour and friend Greece. But it is also a vital issue for France and for Europe.
V levels, which we're hoping, or the government's hoping at least, will end what it's calling the snobbery in post-16 education. We're going to get some reaction to that from the head of Youth in Employment UK. That's next.
Moving in the right direction. It increased its arms exports by 36% in the last 5 years, faster than any other region, and now owns 28% of the world's export market for weapons. France, with its Rafale fighter jet and missile systems, leads European exporters, something showcased here with a French helicopter bought by Cyprus. And a state-of-the-art frigate Greece sent here was just delivered from French shipyards. But the ideological message was equally important.
It's an initiative that in practice breathes new life into this article of the treaty, because if not now, when? If we don't act together in such a crisis, how will we face possible future crises? Now is the time to make it clear that every inch of European territory cannot be violated.
And so is the economic message of this high-profile visit, that Europe will keep waterways open for international trade and energy flows. After Russia's war in Ukraine and decades of wars in the Middle East, it is determined to protect its economy from inflation. The subtext of this camaraderie among Europeans is not just that Europe doesn't need the security assistance of the United States, but that the United States has now become part of the problem rather than the solution. John Saropoulos, Al Jazeera, Paphos Air Force Base, Cyprus.